Welcome to Crossroad Connection. We're speaking out for those left unheard. My name is Art Finwaldi, and I'm the host for this episode. Today we have with us Kristen Staley, Associate Director of Michigan Council on Crime and Delinquency. Welcome, Kristen.
Hi, thank you.
It's good to have you with us here today, and we're going to be talking about youth in the criminal justice system. And we have been chatting before we began taping about your passion here. And you have a passion for the defense system for juveniles. Mm-hmm. And you want to be an advocate for that. And let's begin speaking about that. Can you talk about your passion here?
Sure, absolutely. It really kind of stemmed from when a few years back when I actually worked a little bit in the state of Kentucky within the juvenile defense system there, and it became very clear to me that juvenile justice is a very specific sect of law where it intersects between criminal justice, family law, education, and you're really dealing with clients that are teenagers that are developing in a very rapidly, but yet not so rapid way that these aren't fully yet adults, and so they are it's a very impressionable time of people's lives, and so they have a special need for advocates at every certain stage, especially if you're getting in trouble, and especially if they're entering into the court or justice system. And so when I made my way back up to Michigan, I was very surprised to learn how broken our not only just our criminal defense system is, but especially our juvenile defense. That very rarely do we see juvenile defense advocates across the state. Youth are entering the court systems without having attorneys or advocates by their sides, but yet they have an absolute right to have an attorney or an advocate at every stage of the justice system. And so it's something that really kind of hits home with me, and it really does drive my passion and the work that I do. I don't necessarily practice juvenile defense. I focus a lot more on policies and trying to figure out ways to promote best practices within the system and within those stakeholders that work within, with youth and people who work at the top level with lawmakers. Okay. And so that's kind of where things start with me.
Okay, you wrote a report a year ago. It was called Youth Beyond Bars. And in that report, you discovered some pretty astonishing things about juvenile delinquency and what happens to juveniles in the state of Michigan. And can you talk about that a bit?
Oh, sure, I'd be happy to. And so about a year ago, we published a report called Youth Beyond Bars, and it's pertaining to what the impact of prosecuting and sentencing young people in the state of Michigan and what impact that has on these people, on their families, and on the communities that they're coming from. This is the first time that we really see a cumulative understanding of how many people under the age of 18 are being sentenced and prosecuted as adults in the state of Michigan and entering our correction system. Since 2000, so we looked at the data between the year 2003 and 2013, and we found that over 20,000 young people are under the age of 18 have been sentenced and prosecuted as an adult and entered the correction system.
So a juvenile, 20,000 juveniles in 10 years have been prosecuted as adults.
Yes, yes. And it's very striking. But what's interesting to know about that large 20,000 number is that 95% of that number of those youth were 17 years old at the age of an offense that was committed. And the reason that they're in that system is because Michigan is one of only 9 states left in the entire country that automatically tries and sentences 17-year-olds as adults. So if we think of, a 17-year-old, we have laws in the state of Michigan where you have to stay in the school system until you turn 18. You can't vote until you turn 18. You can't enter the military services. But yet, in the eyes of the criminal justice system, you are automatically considered an adult, and all of your actions are judged as such. So it's a little bit out of step, and it's very much out of step with the rest of the country.
What does this do for the juvenile when they are tried as an adult?
It's for anybody who's caught up in the justice system, it's a really traumatic experience. Of course, many people who are there is because some sort of offense was occurred, and there's some sort of, this is a process that happens when someone commits a crime or an offense. But oftentimes, what we found, especially through our research, of that 20,000 number of those 17-year-olds especially, about 2/3 of those are young people who committed an offense that was on a low-level scale, non-violent, non-harming of another person. In many cases, you can actually add that up to delinquent adolescent behavior, youthful behavior, things that are crimes, but yet because they are 17 and they are now technically an adult in the eyes of the law in the state of Michigan, they enter the adult criminal justice system, and so they end up with a record that is very hard to get rid of. It's hard to, enter, to try and get housing, to try and get a job, to sometimes, depending on the crime, it prohibits you from getting federal funding for college or any type of student loan funding. Voting, you have all sorts of stigmas attached to you that you have to explain by, oh, well, this 1 year or two I was gone because of what reason. There's all sorts of just problems that cycle and just escalate throughout your life once you enter the system. Whether or not, even if you aren't ending up in really deep inside of a prison, just having that offense on your record can be so stigmatizing.
In your report, any research done on the juvenile delinquency? How many of them become repeat offenders?
Sure. Not so much in our report, but what we do find based on other research is that, especially for young people who enter the adult criminal justice system, and there's been many studies done where there's comparing both young people who are committing offenses but are staying in the juvenile system and having the ability to be treated as an age-appropriate, developmentally appropriate manner. Michigan, fortunately enough, has a really robust juvenile justice court system. There's a broad spectrum of a lot of community-based services, things like family therapies or mentoring programs, other types of like probationary things that can keep a young person from going further and further into the system. But on our criminal justice side, which is the adult side, if you turn 17 or if somehow you escalate into that side of the system, the spectrum is just not broad and it's not age appropriate. And so what you see is, because it's not really meant for people of a younger age, it's so much more likely for a young person to reoffend, to not get appropriate treatment, if they needed something, to really just kind of rehabilitate. And so it's logical that we see that the number is about 34% of youth who are in the adult system actually reoffend, and they do so much sooner and much more violently than those who would stay in a juvenile system.
Because it's not age appropriate.
It's not age appropriate.
It's not help that is aimed at a juvenile.
Exactly. It's meant for adults. Okay. These are things, when you're a teenager, before brain research exists showing that your brain and your just your maturity and your entire body, you just don't fully develop until around age 24, age 25. I think that many of us can remember when we were 17 or when we were younger, and the differences between us then and us now, and it's completely different people. And much research shows that you really just kind of age out of delinquency or out of criminal behaviors. But yet, those are the prime years where you see people entering the justice system or entering the correction system. Our prisons across the country are filled with people aged 17 to 23 years old. Those are the prime years that somebody will end up into the correction system.
That's sad to me, because I think back through my past, and when I was 16, 17 years old, I did idiotic things.
Sure.
And many people that are that age do idiotic things. And to have someone that is 16 or 17, make a mistake, and then be tried as an adult, and then have those years taken away from that's sad for me. And I'm also a dad, and I have 4 kids. My ages of my kids go from 24 down to 15.
Okay, sure.
So yeah, I know what it's like for the younger teenagers, what I'm like to them. And yeah, when they get to 24, you know, hey, mom and dad, they do understand.
Oh my goodness, you're like a normal person.
Yeah.
You're not just mom and dad anymore.
I'm no longer on Mars.
Exactly. So it's, I mean, actually, that's a great example of you can really see the difference between 15 and 24 in terms of how they can relate to what's right and what's wrong, and you know how we should act so that it doesn't affect another person, and that you know we're all involved in one community, and that it's about you know that you shouldn't go, I don't know, you know, commit something stupid, that you shouldn't go steal from somebody else because it affects this person, you know, and that you're involved in a community. And I think that while there's a lot of different things, and that's not to say that, you know, just because you're 15, that means it gives you an okay to go and commit a crime.
Right.
Of course not. And that's not, I think that's completely far away from what we're trying to talk about, but it's more about that if something is happening and you're deviating in some fashion, you know, let's take a moment and really kind of dive into what's happening here. You know, that if there's going to be some sort of treatment or some sort of rehabilitation, it should be focused on a 15-year-old person, not that something that's meant for somebody who's 35 years old and has already lived a life, you know, has, you know, been able to be a part of the community, has held a job most likely, and has literally even driven a car. You know, when we did this work and we see these numbers of 17-year-olds or younger that have entered the prison system, you know, they're going behind bars before they've ever graduated high school, before they've ever like opened a bank account on their own, before they've probably ever even gone grocery shopping on their own. Things like this where they've never really fully experienced what it means to be an adult in a community. And so it's that much harder for them to kind of re-enter society, because most of the young people who are in the prison don't stay in there very long. We found that if those who do enter prison, they only stay there on average from a 2 to 5 year sentence.
Okay.
In fact, and many of them only received either jail time or probation. And so, of course, with probation, you can live in the community, but yet you still are stigmatized because you have a criminal record. You know, it's very difficult to live on your own, to have a job, to all those things that we just talked about before. But any level of incarceration really kind of pushes you back that much farther from really kind of developing. It really stunts a person's development.
And think about that person when they go into prison, let's say they're 17 years old, and then they're released when they're 22, 23.
Right.
And then all of those things in life, like learning how to drive, getting bank accounts, like you said, all those things that we take for granted, they have to learn. They don't have those skills.
Right, exactly.
And they're thrust right into it.
Right. And you know, we're very hopeful that many of these young people have other support systems. They have families or you know, other adults or people to kind of guide them as they come through. But often that's not the case. Part of our research was also understanding not just what are the offenses and where are these young people coming from in the state of Michigan, but really who are these kids? Like we found that about 78% of them, prior to them entering the adult system, had experienced a friend or someone close to them that had been murdered or had been killed in some fashion. That almost, I believe it was around 48% of these young people had experienced a family member that had been killed.
Oh, wow.
That, you know, so these young people are a lot of them had already experienced a lot of trauma. Many of these, about 44%, almost half, had entered the foster care system at some point in time. And of those that did, they had been placed on average of 11 separate placements. So these kids have been uprooted from places, you know, lots of trauma experience. Many of these young people are living in single-parent homes that, you know, rely on certain public benefits, meaning that they're on a lower economic scale. And very often you see these, it's a multi-generational problem where, you know, mom or dad or even siblings are incarcerated or have been in the system, and so therefore, you know, little Johnny or somebody or Mary growing up sees that, and that's what ends up happening to them as well.
They are doing what has been modeled to them.
Precisely, yep.
Well, we're going to take a break now,
Sure.
But when we come back from our break, we're going to talk a bit about what can be done to solve this issue of juvenile delinquency and juveniles being tried as adults.
Great.
So we'll be back in a few moments with this episode of Crossroad Connection.
Stay connected to what's happening at Crossroad Bible Institute with Crossroad Network News. This free magazine is designed to keep you informed and inspired about what Christ Church is doing in prisons and jails. If you'd like a free subscription to Crossroad Network News, fill out the form online by visiting us at cbi.fm.
Welcome back from the break. We are here this afternoon with Kristen Staley, Associate Director of the Michigan Council on Crime and Delinquency. And we have been speaking with Kristen about the effects of juveniles in the criminal justice system. And we want to get to ways we can solve some of the issues, the problems of having many juveniles tried as adults. And Kristen, we're entering an election cycle. And in election cycles, when we listen to commercials, what we often hear is that getting tough on crime is the answer to the issues of crime.
Right.
So in other words, getting tough on crime sells for people seeking political office.
Right.
Can you speak about that?
I'd be happy to. You know, the tough on crime rhetoric, very fortunately, we're actually seeing a new kind of wave, a new saying, if you will. It's no longer being tough on crime. It's important to be smart on crime. And I think that you're seeing this kind of sea change, not just in Michigan, but also across the country, in terms of, you know, political cycles and both, you know, Republicans, Democrats, conservative liberals, like really just understanding that this is the better way to approach things, because we do have a massive problem with our corrections and our justice system in the entire country. You know, in terms of if you look at us and compare it to the rest of the world, we incarcerate, you know, many times over in terms of how many people are in our correction system. It's a large problem with mass incarceration. So it's it's a number one issue on election cycle. And come November, you know, that's always on the tip of everyone's tongue in terms of how can we be more effective. There's a group that's founded in Texas area, but they actually work all across the country.
Okay.
They're called Right on Crime. And we're actually seeing more of a shift in terms of how we approach justice issues and justice reforms, that this concept of being smart, being efficient, the corrections and the court systems, it costs a lot of money, and it really puts a burden on our taxpayer dollars. Not only, and in many ways, you know, if you continue to really use incarceration or very punitive measures, it does very little to actually rehabilitate or to protect people from from criminals from reoffending. Frankly, people who are in prison will most likely come back into the community at some point, more so than not. And if we have to be prepared to what that means. And so we have to not just continue to punish and punish, but to actually bring them back into the community, help them re-enter society, help them be productive, tax-paying, you know, citizens, and not live in fear that people are going to reoffend and become more violent, because that's actually what's happening right now. We have a system set up that really just perpetuates a cycle of violence.
Our system does not rehabilitate.
It does not. It does not. And fortunately enough, we have a lot of politicians that are catching up. Hillary Clinton, for example, is a front runner on the Democratic sides of elections. She's made very public statements saying that she on her platform would to be reform and focus on mass incarceration issues in the country. We have folks like Jeb Bush and Newt Gingrich, who are spokespersons for Right on Crime, talking very publicly across the country about how we need to be much more efficient and smart on crime and not focus on the mass incarceration issue. So really both sides of the aisle are really finally getting the message that this is how we should be approaching things.
You use the word getting smart on crime instead of getting tough on crime. Can you unpack that word, getting smart?
Sure. And this is also a phrase, you know, I think it's the new rhetoric. Yeah. It's a phrase our own governor has used. Just last month, he came out with a special message on criminal justice. And his catchphrase was, we need to be smart, meaning that we need to be very deliberate in terms of how we provide access to the justice system, and how we treat men and women who need rehabilitation, who do commit crimes, and really how to protect people who are victims of crimes or survivors of crime, from being offended, and from having more people come out and commit more offenses. We need to protect public safety, but we need to do it in a way because that does not cost more money, frankly. SMART is really more about being efficient with your dollar, but doing it in a way that also protects the public at the same time, so that you're not going to focus on incarceration, because building large prisons costs a lot of money, and it does very little to rehabilitate a person.
And
So
not only does it cost a lot of money to
Right.
build, it costs an immense amount of money to run.
It does, and at the end of the day, you're doing very little to protect public safety, because those people are bound to get out of prison. The average prison term is not that long. And so really the shift we're seeing is now focusing on what we call community-based services, or alternatives to incarceration. So more focus on probationary tactics, or tethers, or therapeutic options, or things that are really going to kind of get to the root of the problem.
You've chatted with me a bit about some of the bills that are coming, some of the work that your organization has done. Can
Sure.
you explain some of that?
Absolutely. We're really excited to be working with a handful of legislators who've taken interest in our Youth Beyond Bars report. We had recommendations within that report that would effectively reduce the amount of young people that are entering our criminal justice system. And first and foremost is really to what we call raise the age of juvenile jurisdiction. And so, and to come in line with the other 41 states, and frankly the rest of the world. So we would raise the age from 17 to 18. So all 17-year-olds would be considered still youth in the eyes of the court system. That automatically would affect 95% of the young people who are being prosecuted and tried as adults in our state. So it would be a very quick fix, but first in a line of many policy reforms that we could that are in the pipeline.
So does that have traction?
It does, yes. And so we're really excited. And so what actually we're working with Representative Harvey Santana out of Detroit, and he actually took great interest in the package of bills and what he called the youth in prison package. So raise the age is one of them. Another bill would actually effectively remove or prohibit the placement of youth in adult facilities. Those two issues would greatly impact the amount of treatment. Frankly, just we wouldn't have youth in adult correctional facilities. So that would include jails, that would include pretrial, like before sentencing, and it would also preclude any placement within a prison as part of a sentence. And so that also has traction. We expect to see a slew of bills entering. The legislative session is almost out for the summertime, and so we expect to see these bills come into play in the fall.
Okay. What can happen in our communities to help with this issue of juveniles, the juvenile delinquency? What can be done, and what is your organization doing?
A lot of what we focus on, whether it's on youth justice or on adult with criminal justice work, is really understanding that we need to get away from the concept of incarceration, and we need to understand that when people commit offenses or something is happening, that there can be a non-adversarial way of dealing with the system. There's a lot of movement now to really put more resources, whether it's from the state government or really in the county and local levels, into community-based alternatives to incarceration, into different types of diversion or preventative programs, like things like restorative justice is something that we're seeing a lot more, especially in our school systems, where you actually have both the offender and the victim and communities kind of coming together and really understanding what is the problem, how can we fix this, but all together, and coming to a solution as one. We're doing quite a bit of work with families of people who are incarcerated or especially young people who have been through the system. Working with the family unit, because it's so important to understand that this young person, or that this whoever is entering the system, is not just in a silo. They're not just a person in and of themselves. They live in a community. They have a family that they come from. They have people around them that they're being influenced by, and I think kind of changing that whole narrative in the way that we look at people who commit crimes, and why are these happening? Is it because there was no support? Is it because there was lack of training in terms of how to de-escalate a scenario? I think that there's always more education and more to learn in terms of how to destigmatize people who've gone through the system.
What are some of the community-based programs that your organization is suggesting or you have seen work well?
Sure. Well, actually, one partnership we're really trying to delve into is, and I mentioned restorative justice, in Washtenaw County, which is where Ann Arbor is, they have, their juvenile court focuses quite a bit on restorative justice practices, and they have what's called a peacemaking court, where they, and this is particularly for lower level offending youth who are, maybe first-time offenders, or something is happening where they kind of fit the profile of being able to really work within the system. It's based on restorative justice practices, so that if they go through the process and there is a mediation and they can determine ways to repair harm in a non-adversarial way, their juvenile record will be diverted and will no longer be on their record, and it's really seeing great results. It's very transformative.
Okay.
It's something that's completely different in terms of how we see justice, and there's other techniques around. We see something like that very similar in Berrien County. They also incorporate restorative justice techniques in their juvenile court systems, and they've had great results because of it. They understand that these young people have, they're still developing, and that they have certain needs, and that punishment, and that there's no necessarily one-size-fits-all punishment,
Okay.
and so that's what's important.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, Kristen, I want to thank you for coming this afternoon. This has been wonderful to talk with you.
Great.
And to hear about your passion for restoring the criminal justice system, especially as it is in regards to juveniles. And I just pray for God's continued blessings on you and your organization and the work that you do.
Thank you very much.
And would like to say thank you to all of you who have listened to this episode of Crossroad Connection. And till next time, may God bless you.